You wake up in darkness, you can't sit up, your neck hits wood. The air is so thick with sweat, blood, and human waste that every breath burns. You don't know how long you've been chained here. You only know one thing: you are no longer considered human. Now imagine this isn't just you, but millions. Between the 1500s and 1800s, up to 12 million Africans were forced onto ships like this. At least 1.5 million never made it off the ocean alive. By the end of this video, you'll know how this system worked, how it wiped out entire communities, how some people fought back against impossible odds, and the question that still haunts us today: who exactly do we blame for the Atlantic slave trade? Slavery is as old as civilization. Empires from Rome to China to the Islamic caliphates enslaved people. But the transatlantic slave trade was different in three crucial ways. Its scale, the largest forced migration in human history. Its racism, blackness itself became a justification for bondage. Its legacy, it reshaped entire continents and still shapes our world today. From roughly 1500 to 1880, somewhere between 10 and 12 million African men, women, and children were shipped across the Atlantic. Around 15 to 25% died on the journey alone. Most were taken from 6 main regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast, Gold Coast, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, Congo, and Angola. These weren't slaves when they were taken. They were farmers, soldiers, merchants, musicians, blacksmiths, goldsmiths, mothers, fathers, children with cultures, languages, and histories. Europe would strip them of all of that. When Spain and Portugal began conquering the Americas in the early 1500s, they had land but not enough labor. They first forced indigenous people to work in mines and plantations. But warfare, massacres, and European diseases killed millions of native people. The labor supply collapsed. European rulers looked for a new source of workers. At first, even Spain banned shipping Africans directly from Africa, not out of morality, but out of fear. They believed Africans were barbaric, would corrupt European society, and bring pagan practices. But economics spoke louder than fear. On August 18, 1518, King Charles V signed a charter allowing the direct shipment of 4,000 African slaves from Africa to Spanish-American colonies. Soon, the law changed entirely. Slaves could be brought from Africa to the New World as long as they were converted to Christianity during the voyage. Conversion became the excuse, profit was the motive. What emerged was a deadly machine we now call the triangular trade. From Europe to Africa, ships carried guns, textiles, metal goods, alcohol, and manufactured products. From Africa to the Americas, the Middle Passage, they carried enslaved Africans. From the Americas back to Europe, they brought sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, rice, raw materials grown by enslaved labor. Europe provided the capital and ships. The Americas provided the land and resources. And Africa was turned into a reservoir for human labor. This system didn't just enrich a few merchants. It helped build the wealth of entire nations. Most people never learn just how central slavery was to global capitalism. If you want more history that textbooks quietly skip, make sure you're subscribed and hit like so this kind of content doesn't disappear in the algorithm. Now let's go into the belly of the beast, the Middle Passage. An estimated 12.4 million people were loaded onto slave ships. The ships varied in size, but their purpose was the same: pack in as many bodies as possible. Research from the 1790s measured the space allowed per person. A man about 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, a woman 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, young girls 4.5 feet by 1 foot. That's less room than a coffin, for weeks or months at sea. Below deck, the air was hot and stale. The floor was slick with sweat, vomit, blood, feces, and urine. People were chained at the neck, wrists, and ankles, stacked in tiers, shoulder to shoulder. Each person received about 24 ounces of water a day, roughly 2 small soda cans, and a diet of rice or beans barely enough to survive. The crew forced captives to exercise by making them jump or dance on deck while still in chains, simply to keep them from dying too quickly. But many still did. Around 15–25% of Africans died during the Middle Passage. About 20% of European sailors on these voyages also died from disease and brutal conditions. Storms, disease, dehydration, suicide, and abuse turned the Atlantic into a mass grave. Over 1.5 million African lives ended in that water. And yet, incredibly, this was only the middle of their ordeal. Most people in the US are taught a story that centers on North America. But that's not where most enslaved Africans went. So of all Africans carried across the Atlantic, only about 4%, fewer than 400,000, arrived directly in what is now the United States. Roughly half, around 5 million, were sent to Brazil. The rest went mainly to the Caribbean and Spanish America. By 1820, for every one European who had crossed the Atlantic, 4 Africans had been shipped there. And 4 out of every 5 women who crossed were African. Plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil consumed enslaved lives at a horrifying rate. Sugar, in particular, was so deadly that planters often found it cheaper to work people to death and buy new captives than to keep them alive. The Atlantic trade was massive, but it wasn't the only system. From around 650 to 1900, Islamic traders exported an estimated 10 million Africans across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean to places like Arabia, Yemen, Iran, Iraq, and India. At the same time, many Africans were enslaved and kept within Africa itself. The stretch of coast, including parts of today's Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, became so saturated with slave activity that Europeans called it the Slave Coast. In the 1690s, about 30,000 Africans a year were leaving the continent in the Atlantic trade. A century later, that number had risen to around 85,000 per year. By the early 1800s, even with rising abolitionist movements, some 80,000 people were still being taken from Africa each year. Before the trade was fully abolished, over 1 million more Africans would be shipped across the Atlantic. With thousands chained and only dozens of crew, why didn't more enslaved people revolt? Sometimes they did. In 1839, a Spanish slave ship named La Amistad left Cuba with around 100 newly abducted Africans on board. Among them was a man called Sengbe-Pie, known to Americans as Joseph Cinque. One night, armed with whatever they could find, Cinque and about 53 captives rose up. They killed the captain and the cook, sparing only the navigator to sail them back to Sierra Leone. But the navigator deceived them, steering north instead. After weeks at sea, the Amistad was intercepted by the US Navy off the coast of Long Island, New York. The Africans were jailed in Connecticut, and their case exploded into a major political and legal battle. Spain demanded they be returned to Cuba as property. American abolitionists argued they were kidnapped free people defending themselves. In 1840, a federal judge ruled that while slavery was legal in Cuba, importing new slaves from Africa was not. Therefore, these Africans were not lawful slaves. They were victims of illegal kidnapping and had every right to fight for their freedom. The US government appealed. The case reached the Supreme Court. There, former US President John Quincy Adams argued on behalf of the captives. In a stunning ruling, the court upheld the earlier decision and declared the Amistad Africans free. With help from abolitionists and missionary societies, 35 survivors eventually returned to Sierra Leone in 1842. The Amistad Revolt didn't end slavery, but it proved something vital. Even inside this brutal system, Africans resisted, fought back, and sometimes won. Now we reach one of the most uncomfortable parts of this history. Europeans did not usually march inland and kidnap people themselves. Sub-Saharan disease environments were deadly for them. Instead, most captives were taken by other Africans, in wars, raids, or through kidnapping, and then sold to European traders at coastal forts. Powerful African states like Oyo, Ashanti, Dahomey, and others grew rich this way. Some elites even built complex alliances with Europeans. On the Gold Coast, wealthy families would marry their daughters to European traders, creating political and economic bonds. Some African elites sent their sons to study in Europe and America, learning the very system that was destroying their own continent. In Dahomey, the royal elite almost certainly knew what awaited captives overseas. The king even sent diplomats to Portugal and Brazil who returned with information. Dahomey forbade enslaving other Dahomeans, but had no problem selling members of other ethnic groups. Other African rulers, though, were horrified. King Afonso IV of Congo wrote desperate letters to the King of Portugal, pleading for an end to the trade. Each day the traders are kidnapping our people. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. As soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with a red-hot iron. Africans were both victims of a predatory global system, and in many cases, participants who profited from it, but they did not build the ships. They did not create the global markets. They did not turn human beings into an industrial-scale commodity. Europe did. The numbers are almost impossible to grasp. Around 12 million Africans entered the Atlantic trade. At least 1.5 million died on the ships. Many more died in raids, forced marches, and holding forts in Africa. Some historians estimate that half of all deaths linked to the trade happened before people ever saw the ocean. Canadian scholar Adam Jones calls this a genocide, one of the worst holocausts in human history. He argues, if an institution is knowingly maintained and expanded, while everyone involved understands the massive death toll on a specific group, how is that not genocide? Others, like scholar Saidiya Hartman, argue that the goal was not extermination, but profit. Death, she says, was incidental, a byproduct of treating people as cargo, not as humans. When a population is seen as already disposable, its destruction doesn't even register as murder. Whether or not we label it genocide, the result is the same: millions of African lives erased, cultures fractured, generations stolen. When we talk about the Holocaust, we can point directly at Nazi Germany. With the Atlantic slave trade, the picture is more complicated, but no less clear. 7 main European and American powers drove the trade: Portugal, Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, and the United States. They provided ships, guns, credit, insurance, and legal systems that defined Africans as property. They passed laws, protected the trade with navies, and built economies on its profits. African rulers and traders participated, often eagerly, sometimes under pressure, sometimes attempting to limit the worst abuses. But the incentives, weapons, and markets came from Europe. The slave trade also changed African legal systems themselves. Historian Kamani Nahusi notes that in some societies, crimes that once led to fines or other punishments now led to enslavement, because offenders could be sold to Europeans for profit. War became more profitable. Selling your enemies, and sometimes your neighbors, helped buy guns for the next war. The blame then is shared but not equal. Without European demand, financing, and maritime power, there is no transatlantic slave trade on this scale. Without African middlemen, it would have been far harder for Europeans to seize so many people. This was a system built by empires, fueled by greed and paid for in African lives. The world has not forgotten, but it has often tried to minimize. In 1998, UNESCO declared 23 August the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. In 2001, at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, African nations demanded a clear apology from former slave trading countries. Some were willing. But key nations, especially the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States, blocked a formal apology, likely fearing that acknowledging guilt could open the door to reparations. Since 2009, the United Nations has worked on a permanent memorial to the victims of the Atlantic slave trade, a reminder that the wealth of much of the modern world was built on stolen bodies and stolen labor. The Atlantic slave trade wasn't just a tragic chapter in history textbooks. It created the racial hierarchies, economic inequalities, and global power structures we live with today. To understand the present, we have to look unflinchingly at this past. If this video challenged what you were taught, or what you were never taught, there's another story you need to hear next. Click the video on your screen to learn more Black history that almost never makes it into the classroom. You won't see the world the same way afterward.